The Lisbon earthquake of 1755. There are mornings that arrive like any other, the light breaking over familiar rooftops, the bells calling the faithful to prayer, the smell of bread rising from the ovens, the slow stir in a city that has woken this way for centuries. And then there are mornings that do not end, that fracture time itself, that divide everything into what came before and what came after. Lisbon knew many mornings of the first kind. It would know only one of the second. What follows is not a lesson. It is a walk through streets that no longer exist, beside people who did not know they were living their final hours in the world they understood. If you remain until the end, you will not learn what to think about what happened. You will simply know what it felt like to be there, in the churches, in the squares, in the moment when the ground forgot how to be still. Let us begin in the dark, before the dawn, before the bells, before anyone had reason to be afraid. In the autumn of 1755, Lisbon was a city that believed in its own permanence. It stood at the edge of the Atlantic for centuries, watching empires rise and fall while it endured. The Romans had known it. The Moors had held it. The Christians had reclaimed it. And from its harbor, the caravels of Portugal had sailed into unknown waters, returning with the wealth of worlds that Europe had not imagined. Gold from Brazil filled the treasury. Spices from India perfumed the markets. Sugar from the islands sweetened the tables of the wealthy. The Tagus River, broad and patient, carried ships from every corner of the globe into the finest natural harbor in Western Europe. The city climbed the hills above the water in layers of white and gold. The Alfama, ancient and tangled, clung to the slopes where the Moors had once built their walls. The Baixa spread along the riverfront, crowded with merchants and warehouses, with the ceaseless commerce of empire. The Barro Alto rose on the opposite hill, home to monasteries and noble houses, to churches whose altars dripped with Brazilian gold. And everywhere, the bells, dozens of churches, hundreds of bells, marking the hours and the feast days, calling the faithful to Mass, reminding the city that God watched over Portugal with particular care. The population numbered perhaps 250,000 souls. They were Portuguese and African, Brazilian and Indian, a reflection of the empire's reach. They lived in palaces and hovels, in convents and counting houses, in the narrow lanes where laundry hung between buildings, and the broad squares where processions wound on holy days. They complained about taxes and weather, worried about marriages and harvests, gossiped about the court and the price of bread. They were, in other words, ordinary people living ordinary lives in a city they had no reason to believe would not outlast them all. King Jose I ruled from the Ribera Palace, though rule was perhaps too strong a word. The real power belonged to Sebastio Jose de Carvalho y Melo, the chief minister, who would later be known as the Marquis of Pombal, a man whose name meant nothing special in October of 1755, who was simply another ambitious nobleman serving the crown. His time had not yet come. The disaster that would make him had not yet arrived. The autumn had been unremarkable. The rains had come and gone. The harvest had been gathered. The ships continued their ancient traffic in and out of the harbor. October passed into November without incident, without warning, without any sign that the world was about to change. And then it was the morning of the 1st. November 1st was All Saints' Day, one of the holiest days in the Catholic calendar. The churches of Lisbon had been preparing for weeks, cleaning the altars, polishing the silver, arranging the flowers that would honor the blessed dead. The candles had been counted and placed, thousands upon thousands of them, ready to burn in memory of the saints who watched over the faithful from heaven. The dawn came cool and clear. The sky was blue, the air still, the light falling golden on the white walls and red roofs of the city. The bells began their calling before the sun had fully risen, their voices overlapping and echoing across the hills, summoning the devout to Mass. And the devout came, in their finest clothes, in their everyday clothes, in the habits of religious orders and the simple dress of servants. They came to the cathedral, to São Roque, to São Domingos, to the dozens of parish churches and the private chapels of the wealthy. They came because it was their duty, because it was their habit, because it was what one did on All Saints' Day in a city that had always done it this way. By 9 o'clock, the churches were full. The masses had begun, the priests moving to the familiar rituals, the congregations responding with words they had spoken since childhood. The incense rose toward painted ceilings. The candles flickered in their holders. The light fell through windows of colored glass, painting the stone floors with patterns of red and blue and gold. Outside, the streets had grown quiet. The markets were closed for the holy day. The taverns would not open until after Mass. The ships sat at anchor, their crews given leave to attend services or simply to rest. Even the dogs seemed subdued, as if they too understood that this was a morning set apart, a morning for prayer and contemplation, a morning when the city paused to remember its dead and honor its saints. At approximately 20 minutes before 10 o'clock, someone in the congregation of Sal Vicente de Fora might have noticed the chandeliers begin to sway. Someone in the Baixa might have felt a vibration through the soles of their shoes, a tremor so faint it could have been imagined. Someone on the waterfront might have seen the water in the harbor shiver, its surface disturbed by something that was not wind. But these were small things, easily dismissed, easily forgotten in the solemnity of the Mass. The priests continued their prayers. The congregations continued their responses. The candles continued to burn, and then the world broke open. The sound came first, or perhaps it came at the same moment as the motion, the two so intertwined that survivors would never agree on which they had noticed first. It was a roar from deep within the earth, a sound like nothing anyone had ever heard, like thunder that came from below rather than above, like the growl of some vast creature stirring beneath the city. Then the shaking began. It was not a tremor. It was not a vibration. It was a violence that defied comprehension, a movement so extreme that the solid earth became liquid, that walls built to last centuries cracked like eggshells, that people who had been standing found themselves thrown to ground without understanding how they had fallen. In the churches, the congregations had only seconds to react. The chandeliers that had been swaying crashed to floors. The candles toppled from their holders, their flames catching on cloth and wood. The statues of saints fell from their pedestals, shattering on the stone. The ceilings, painted with scenes of heaven, gilded with the gold of empire, cracked and buckled and came down on the worshippers below. Those nearest the doors fought to reach them, climbing over pews, over bodies, over the rubble that was already falling. Those trapped in the center of the congregations could only pray, could only scream, could only watch as the walls around them leaned inward and the roofs above them gave way. The churches that had been sanctuaries became tombs. Outside was no better. The buildings of the Baixa, many of them 5 or 6 stories tall, swayed and crumbled. The narrow streets filled with falling stone, with timber, with tiles that slid from roofs like deadly rain. People who had been walking to church found themselves buried. People who had been sleeping late were killed in their beds. People who had been lighting fires in their kitchens, preparing food for the feast day meal, watched as their walls collapsed around them, as their hearts spilled their coals onto floors that would soon be burning. The first shock lasted perhaps 90 seconds. To those who survived it, those 90 seconds lasted forever. When the shaking stopped, there was a moment of silence, the kind of silence that exists only in the aftermath of catastrophe, when the world has been so thoroughly changed that even sound does not know how to continue. Then the screaming began. It came from everywhere, from beneath the rubble, from the streets, from the ruined churches, from the hillsides where people had watched their homes collapse. It was a sound of pain and terror, of disbelief and despair, of people calling for help that could not come quickly enough, of people calling for family members who would never answer. The survivors stumbled into the streets, many of them bleeding, many of them barely clothed, all of them dazed. They found a city they no longer recognized. Where buildings had stood, there were now piles of broken stone. Where streets had run straight, there were now obstacles of debris that blocked all passage. The dust that rose from the destruction filled the air like fog, turning the bright morning dim, coating everything in a gray powder that tasted of lime and death. Those who could move began to search for family, for friends, for anyone who might still be alive beneath the wreckage. They dug with their hands, with broken boards, with anything they could find. They lifted stones that should have been too heavy to lift, driven by desperation that made the impossible merely difficult. Some found what they were looking for. Survivors pulled from the rubble, injured but alive, able to be carried to safety. Many more found only the dead. And then, perhaps 5 minutes after the first shock had ended, the ground began to move again. The The second earthquake was, if anything, worse than the first. Buildings that had been damaged, but still standing now, collapsed entirely. Walls that had been cracked fell outward into streets already choked with debris. The survivors who had gathered in the open spaces, hoping that the worst was over, watched as the destruction continued. As the city that had partially fallen now fell completely, the churches suffered terribly in the second shock. The great dome of the Basilica de Estrella cracked and partially collapsed. The Tower of São Roque leaned and fell. The Carmo Convent, one of the largest Gothic structures in Lisbon, saw its roof come down, its nave open to the sky, its congregation buried beneath stones that had stood for 300 years. The royal palace on the Terreiro do Paco was destroyed. The Opera House, one of the finest in Europe, completed just 7 months earlier, crumbled. The hospital Rio de Todos Os Santos, filled with the sick and the dying, pancaked floor upon floor, killing patients and staff alike in a cascade of stone. This second shock lasted perhaps 2 minutes. When it ended, Lisbon was no longer a damaged city. It was a ruin, but the earth was not finished. A third shock came, weaker than the first two, but strong enough to complete what they had begun, to bring down walls that had somehow remained standing, to ensure that nothing that could fall was left unfallen. When this final tremor subsided, the seismic destruction was complete, but the disaster had only entered its second phase. The candles that had burned in the churches did not extinguish when they fell. In the Baixa, where the buildings were older, where the timber was dry, where the narrow streets created canyons that channeled the wind, the fires found everything they needed to grow. They started in dozens of places simultaneously. In kitchens where cooking fires had spilled, in churches where votive candles had ignited vestments, in homes where oil lamps had shattered. Within minutes, the individual fires began to merge. Within an hour, entire districts were burning. The survivors faced an impossible choice. Many of their family members, their neighbors, their friends were still trapped beneath the rubble, still alive, still calling for help. But the fires were spreading, consuming the very buildings beneath which those victims lay. To stay and dig was to risk being caught by the flames. To flee was to abandon those who might still be saved. Some stayed. They worked until the heat drove them back, until the smoke made breathing impossible, until the screams from beneath the rubble stopped. Silenced by rescue or by death or by the flames that reached them first. Others fled to the river, to the open squares, to anywhere that seemed safe from the fire that was now devouring what the earthquake had left. The fires would burn for 5 days. They would consume what remained of the Baixa, what remained of the commercial district, what remained of the libraries and archives that held the records of Portugal's history. They would melt the gold that adorned the altars, destroy the paintings that hung in the churches, reduce the accumulated wealth of centuries to ash and slag. And still the disaster was not complete. The tsunami arrived approximately 40 minutes after the first earthquake. Those who had fled to the waterfront, believing that the open space of the Terreiro do Paco offered safety from falling buildings and spreading fires, were the first to notice that something strange was happening to the river. The Tagus, which had flowed past Lisbon for millennia, was behaving in ways that no one had ever seen. First, the water receded. It pulled back from the shore, exposing the riverbed, revealing mud and sand and the wrecks of boats that had sunk in ages past. Fish flopped in pools left behind by the retreating water. Anchored ships suddenly found themselves resting on mud rather than floating free. Some of the survivors, curious despite everything, walked out onto the newly exposed ground. They wanted to see what the strange withdrawal had revealed. They wanted to salvage cargo from the boats that now sat stranded. They wanted, perhaps, simply to understand what was happening in a world that had ceased to make sense. They were still there when the wave came. It was not a single wave, but a series of them, each surge of water pushing further into the city than the one before. The first wave was perhaps 15 or 20 feet high, enormous, terrifying, carried with it a churning mass of debris that had been floating in the harbor. It swept across the Terreiro do Paco, where thousands of survivors had gathered. It crashed into the waterfront buildings, or what remained of them. It carried boats inland, smashing them against the ruins of warehouses. It carried people, some already dead, some still struggling, deep into the streets of the Baixa. The wave receded, dragging with it everything it could carry. bodies, furniture, cargo, the accumulated detritus of a destroyed city. And then, perhaps 15 minutes later, it returned. The second wave was larger than the first. The third was larger still. Each surge pushed further inland, reached higher up the streets, claimed more victims. Those who had survived the earthquake and fled the fires now drowned in the streets of their own city, killed by water that had traveled across the ocean from somewhere, from a rupture in the seafloor that no one in Lisbon could see or understand. When the waters finally receded for the last time, they left behind a new landscape of devastation. The waterfront was destroyed. The ships that had filled the harbor were scattered, sunk, or driven far inland. The bodies of the drowned lay mixed with the bodies of those who had been crushed or burned, creating a carpet of death that covered the lower city. By nightfall on November 1st, 1755, Lisbon had experienced earthquake, fire, and flood. The city that had woken that morning confident in its permanence had been, in the space of a few hours, essentially destroyed. The night that followed was the longest in Lisbon's history. The survivors gathered where they could, in the squares that had not been flooded, on the hillsides above the burning city, in the fields outside the walls where the ground at least felt solid. They had no food, no water, no shelter beyond what they could improvise from salvaged materials. Many had no shoes, having fled their homes too quickly to dress. Many had no family, having watched them die or lost them to chaos. All of them had lost the world they had known that morning. The fires illuminated the darkness with a hellish orange glow. The smoke blotted out the stars. The cries of the trapped, those still alive beneath the rubble, those caught in buildings of flames had not yet reached, carried across the city, growing fewer as the hours passed, as rescue became impossible, as death took those who could not be saved. The aftershocks continued through the night. Each tremor sent fresh waves of panic through the survivors, who had learned that the ground could not be trusted, that stability was an illusion, that at any moment the shaking might return and finish what it had started. Some people spent the entire night standing, refusing to sit or lie down, as if remaining upright might somehow protect them from the next collapse. The social order had dissolved. In the darkness, looters moved through the ruins, taking what they could find, jewelry from the dead, silver from the churches, goods from the shattered warehouses. Some were locals, desperate for anything that might help them survive. Others were criminals who saw opportunity in catastrophe. A few were simply people who no longer believed that the rules of civilization applied in a world where God had permitted such destruction. The priests who had survived moved among the refugees, offering what comfort they could. They heard confessions from the dying. They administered last rites to those who would not see morning. They tried to make sense of what had happened, tried to find words that might explain why God had permitted his faithful to be killed in his own churches on one of the holiest days of the year. They found no words. There were no words. Dawn came slowly, as if the sun itself was reluctant to reveal what the night had hidden. The fires still burned, though they had begun to diminish as they ran out of fuel. The smoke still hung over the city, mixing with the morning mist from the river to create a haze that softened the edges of the destruction without concealing its scale. The bodies still lay where they had fallen, in the streets, in the ruins, along the waterfront. Too many to count, too many to bury, too many to even begin to comprehend. King Jose had survived. He had been at the royal estate in Belém, outside the city, when the earthquake struck. The buildings there had been damaged, but the royal family had escaped without serious injury. The king was said to be in shock, unable to speak, unable to give orders, unable to do anything but stare at the smoke rising from his capital. It was Pombal who took command. He had survived as well, and unlike the king, he was capable of action. In the hours and days that followed, he would issue the orders that would define Lisbon's response to the disaster. Bury the dead before disease could spread. Feed the living with whatever supplies could be found. Prevent flight by closing the ports and posting guards on the roads. Hang looters without trial to restore order. Begin planning the reconstruction before the rubble had even cooled. His methods were brutal. His efficiency was extraordinary. His vision was clear. Lisbon would not be abandoned. Lisbon would be rebuilt. Lisbon would rise from the ruins greater than before. But that was the future. In the immediate aftermath, there was only survival, the search for water, The search for food, the search for family members who might still be alive, the search for any reason to believe that life would continue. The dead presented the most immediate problem. There were too many of them. The estimates would range from 30,000 to 60,000 or more, but in those first days, no one was counting. The bodies were everywhere, in the rubble, in the streets, floating in the river, washed up along the shore. In the November warmth, they had already begun to decay. The smell was becoming unbearable. The risk of epidemic was growing by the hour. The church demanded proper Christian burial. Every soul deserved a grave, a prayer, a marker that would allow the living to remember and the dead to rest. But there were not enough graves, not enough priests, not enough time. The ground itself was too disrupted, too unstable, too full of rubble to dig the thousands of graves that would be needed. Pombal made the decision that horrified the faithful, but saved the city from plague. The bodies were loaded onto barges, weighted with stones, and disposed of at sea. It was practical. It was necessary. It was an offense against everything the Catholic Church held sacred about the treatment of the dead. The priests protested. Some refused to participate. Some preached against Pombal from what remained of their pulpits, calling the mass disposal of bodies a sin that would bring further divine punishment upon a city that had clearly already offended God. Pombal had the most vocal of them arrested. He would deal with the church later, when there was time for politics. For now, there was only the urgent business of preventing the dead from killing the living. The living needed to be fed. The warehouses along the waterfront, filled with grain, with wine, with the goods of empire, had been destroyed by earthquake and flood and fire. The markets that normally supplied the city had ceased to function. The roads that connected Lisbon to the countryside were blocked by refugees fleeing outward and by rubble that would take weeks to clear. Pombal commandeered everything that could be commandeered. Ships in the harbor still held cargo that had not yet been unloaded. Estates outside the city had stores that could be requisitioned. Fishing boats could be sent out to bring back whatever they could catch. Bread ovens were set up in the refugee camps, producing loaves that were distributed to anyone who needed them. It was not enough. It could not be enough. The scale of the disaster was simply too great. The number of survivors too large. The destruction of infrastructure too complete. People went hungry. People died of exposure in the November nights. People succumbed to injuries that might have been survivable if there had been hospitals, doctors, medicine, any of the resources that the earthquake had destroyed. But the response prevented the worst. There was no mass starvation. There was no epidemic. The refugees survived, most of them, through the terrible first weeks, through the winter that followed, through the long years of reconstruction that lay ahead. The question that haunted every survivor was the one that had no answer. Why? The earthquake had struck on All Saints' Day, during Mass, in the churches of one of the most devoutly Catholic cities in Europe. The timing seemed deliberately cruel, as if God had chosen the moment of greatest piety to deliver his greatest punishment. The faithful had been killed at prayer. The churches had collapsed on their congregations. The holy day had become a day of death. The preachers offered explanations. Gabriel Malagrida, the most famous Jesuit in Portugal, declared that the earthquake was divine punishment for sins of Lisbon, for the pride, the luxury, the moral corruption that had festered beneath the city's pious surface. The proper response, he argued, was repentance. The survivors should process through the streets, flagellating themselves, begging God's forgiveness for whatever transgressions had provoked such wrath. Some found comfort in this explanation. It gave meaning to meaningless suffering. It suggested that the disaster, however terrible, was part of a divine plan that human beings could influence through proper behavior. It restored a sense of order to a world that had revealed itself to be terrifyingly disordered. Others found the explanation impossible to accept. Why would God punish the faithful for attending Mass? Why would he destroy churches while leaving brothels standing? Why would he kill infants who had committed no sin, nuns who had devoted their lives to his service, priests who had been celebrating the Mass in his honor? The philosophers of the Enlightenment seized on the earthquake as evidence for their arguments against providential explanations of natural events. Voltaire, writing from Geneva, composed a poem on the Lisbon disaster that challenged anyone to look at such suffering and still believe in a benevolent God who intervened in human affairs. His later novel, Candide, would use the earthquake as the centerpiece of the attack on philosophical optimism, the idea that this was the best of all possible worlds. The debate would continue for decades. It would contribute to the secularization of European thought, to the rise of scientific explanations for natural phenomena, to a new understanding of earthquakes as geological events rather than divine interventions. The Lisbon earthquake did not just destroy a city, it helped destroy a worldview. The reconstruction began before the ruins had cooled. Pombal understood that Lisbon could not simply be restored. The city that had grown organically over centuries, the tangled streets of the Alfama, the cramped lanes of Moraria, the narrow buildings that had collapsed so catastrophically, had been proven vulnerable. The new Lisbon would have to be different. It would have to be designed. He commissioned engineers and architects to create a plan. The new city would be built on a grid, its streets wide and straight, its buildings uniform in height and design. The construction would incorporate innovations meant to resist earthquakes, flexible wooden frames within the masonry walls, symmetrical designs that distributed stress evenly, lower heights that reduced the danger of collapse. The Baixa Pombalina, as it would be called, will become one of the first examples of earthquake-resistant urban planning in history. It would be a monument to Enlightenment rationality, a city of order imposed on chaos, a declaration that human ingenuity could triumph over natural disaster. The work would take decades. Tens of thousands of laborers would clear the rubble, lay the foundations, raise the walls. The cost would strain the treasury, requiring new taxes, new loans, new extractions from Brazil's gold mines. The social disruption would continue for a generation, as people who had lost everything struggled to rebuild their lives in a city that was itself being rebuilt around them. Not everything would be restored. Some of the great churches would remain ruins, their shattered walls left standing as memorials to what had been lost. The Carmel convent, its Gothic arches open to sky, would never be roofed again. It stands today as it stood in the months after the earthquake, a reminder, carved in stone, of what happened on the morning of November 1st, 1755. The months passed. The seasons turned. The fires had long since burned out, and the rubble was slowly being cleared. The refugees who had camped in the fields began to find more permanent shelter, in buildings that had survived, in temporary structures erected on the outskirts, in the new constructions that were beginning to rise where the old city had fallen. Life resumed, because life always resumes. Markets reopened, selling whatever goods could be found. Ships returned to the harbor, though many of the wharves they had once used were gone. Babies were born to families who had lost children in the disaster. Couples married who had met in the refugee camps. The rhythms of daily existence, work, rest, worship, celebration, reasserted themselves, altered but not destroyed. The survivors carried their memories differently. Some spoke constantly of the earthquake, reliving the terror, unable to let go of what they had experienced. Others refused to speak of it all, as if silence could somehow erase the trauma. Children who had been too young to remember would grow up hearing stories of the day the world ended, absorbing their parents' grief without fully understanding its source. The anniversary came and went. November 1st, 1756, a year since the disaster. The churches that remained held services of remembrance. The priests who had rebuilt their congregations offered prayers for the dead. The survivors who gathered in the squares and the camps and the new buildings of the rising city paused to remember what they had lost, who they had lost, the world that had existed before the morning when everything changed. And then they returned to the work of living, because there was no alternative, because the dead were dead and the living had to continue, because that is what human beings do in the aftermath of catastrophe. They endure. Years pass. The new city rises. Where the tangled streets of the old Baixa once stood, there are now broad avenues and uniform facades. The buildings are 3 and 4 stories tall, their design standardized, their construction supervised by engineers who understand, as their predecessors did not, that the ground beneath Lisbon cannot be entirely trusted. The Terreiro do Paco has been redesigned as the Praça do Comércio, a grand square open to the river, flanked by arcaded buildings that house the government ministries. A triumphal arch marks the entrance to the new city, celebrating not victory in war, but triumph over disaster. Pombal has risen with the city. He is now the Marquis of Pombal, the most powerful man in Portugal, the architect not just of New Lisbon, but of a new Portuguese state, more centralized, more rational, more hostile to the church that had dared to challenge his authority. Malagrida, the Jesuit who had preached divine punishment, has been executed by the Inquisition on trumped-up charges of heresy, his real crime having been opposition to the minister who rebuilt the city. The Jesuits themselves have been expelled from Portugal, their vast properties confiscated, their influence broken. The survivors have aged. The children who fled the collapsing buildings are now adults with children of their own. The young couples who married in the aftermath are now middle-aged. Their lives shaped by a disaster they carry in memory but no longer speak of daily. The elderly who witnessed the earthquake have mostly died, taking their first-hand accounts with them, leaving behind only the stories they told of those who were too young to remember. The earthquake has entered history. It is written about in chronicles and scientific treatises, debated by philosophers and theologians, referenced in sermons and novels and poems. It has become a fixed point in the European imagination, a symbol of nature's destructive power, of the limits of human confidence, of the questions that arise when suffering seems to have no meaning. But for those who lived through it, for those who lost family and home and everything they had known, the earthquake was never a symbol. It was simply what happened. It was a morning that did not end. It was the sound and the shaking and the fire and the water. It was the faces of the dead and the cries of the trapped and the long nights in the camps when the ground trembled and no one could sleep. They do not need monuments to remember. They remember in their bones. The light fades over the Tagus, painting the water in colors that have not changed since before the earthquake, since before Lisbon, since before human beings stood on these hills and decided to build a city. The river flows as it has always flowed, carrying the debris of centuries toward the sea. The ships move through the harbor as they have always moved, smaller now than in the days of empire, different in design, but following the same currents that guided the caravels of discovery. The bells ring from the churches that remain, calling the faithful to evening prayer, their voices echoing across a city that is both the same and utterly different from the one that stood here before November 1st, 1755. The earth is quiet. It has been quiet for years, for decades, offering no hint of what it did, no warning of what it might do again. The people who walk the streets of the Baixa Pombalina do not think about earthquakes. They think about dinner and work and love, and all the ordinary concerns that fill ordinary lives. They have inherited a city built to withstand destruction, but they have not inherited the memory of the destruction that made such building necessary. That memory lives only in the records now, in the letters and diaries, in the official reports and private accounts, in the stones of the Carmel convent that still stand open to the sky. It lives in the grid pattern of the streets, in the uniform facades of the buildings, in the engineering innovations that are invisible unless you know to look for them. It lives in the absence of what was lost, the medieval churches, the ancient libraries, the accumulated treasures of centuries that burned or drowned or were buried beyond recovery. The city endures. It has always endured. It endured the Romans and the Moors, the plagues and the fires, the earthquake that should have ended it and did not. It will endure whatever comes next, because that is what cities do, what people do, what life does in the face of forces that should, by all rights, sweep it away. The camera pulls back slowly from the waterfront, from the broad square and the triumphal arch and the hills that rise behind them. The last light catches the white walls and the red roofs, the church towers and the castle on the height. The city grows smaller, receding into the distance, becoming a pattern of light and shadow at the edge of the darkening sea. Somewhere in that pattern, the survivors lived out their lives. Somewhere in those streets, children played who would never know what their parents had witnessed. Somewhere in those churches, prayers were offered for souls that had departed on November morning when the world broke open and refused, for a few terrible hours, to be whole again. The earthquake is over. It has been over for a long time. But in another sense, it is never over. It continues in the shape of the city, in the memories passed down through generations, in the questions that still have no answers about why such things happen and what they mean. History does not end. It simply recedes, growing smaller and quieter, until it becomes a silence beneath the noise of the present, the foundation beneath the streets we walk without thinking, the story we have forgotten we are living inside. Lisbon stands at the edge of the Atlantic, as it has always stood. The river flows past, as it has always flowed. And somewhere in a fading light, the people of the city go about the business of living, as they always have, as they always will, on ground that once moved and may move again, but that for now, for this evening, for this moment, is still. There are other cities, other moments when the world changed, and the people who lived through it had to find ways to continue. Other silences that settled over ruined streets, other dawns that revealed what the darkness had hidden, other stories that deserve to be remembered. If this one stayed with you, if you felt the ground shift, if you heard the bells fall silent, if you understood, even for a moment, what it meant to lose a world and have to build another, then perhaps you will walk with us again. History is not finished with its telling, and neither, it seems, are we.